Any other questions out there? I'm glad actually somebody asked that question because I wanted to cover subjects. Yeah.
I have a question about the async iterator proposal.
Yeah.
Do you see any way that you can use them together with observables?
Absolutely. The main difference between an async iterator and an observable, as I think I alluded to earlier, is an async iterator is almost exactly, but not entirely exactly like an iterator of promises. So I say, hey, give me the next value, and then the producer, instead of giving me the value immediately, it gives me a promise which eventually resolves to the value. And what's great about that is for things like I/O, for example, I can read data at my leisure, right? I can say, like, let's say I'm writing out to an output stream, and I can only write so fast. Well, I can decide to read. Whenever I'm ready, I just call next, and I get the next value, right? So asynchronous iterables, just like regular iterables, the consumer is in power, and they decide when to pull the next value. Observable flips that around, right? With an observable, the producer decides when you get the next value. And there's no way of telling the observable, cool it for a while, man. I'm not quite ready yet. You can unsubscribe, but that's not the same thing as pausing the observable, right? If you unsubscribe and you resubscribe, you might cancel a network request and kick off a whole new network request, which could get different data. So it's important to understand that unsubscribing and resubscribing might have a whole bunch of side effects, and it's not the same as pausing a stream. Does that make sense? So in order to adapt an observable into an asynchronous iterator, basically you need some back pressure strategy. You need a way of kind of pausing the observable, even though there's no way out of the box of pausing an observable. And the most obvious strategy is two obvious ones. One is buffer, right? Well, data's coming, but the consumer's not ready for it yet, so I'm going to put it over here in a buffer. And then the other one is drop. Just throw the data away, right? You could basically, it's like a buffer of one. You could put it in one, and then you could throw away any overflow data.
Isn't that kind of what a debounce is then?
Well, it's similar to a debounce, but it's not the same thing, because in a debounce, usually you're doing it for some period of time, whereas in this case, you're kind of debouncing until the consumer sends you an explicit request signal. And there's no concept of that in an observable, right? There's no like pull, it's all push. But it's similar in some way to the debounce. And then of course, you could drop all the new ones, you could also drop all the old ones. There's a whole bunch of variations. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward to adapt an observable into an async iterable, as long as you don't mind losing a little data or you don't mind an unbounded buffer. Now in general, you're probably, since async iterable is the most flexible type, like you can always, in the end, you can always adapt an observable into an async iterable. You could also go the other way as well, right? That would just mean for looping over the async iterable and then nexting and pushing out, right? In general, I'm not sure how commonly they're going to be used together. In practice, I think you're going to see a lot more async iterables on the server, and you're going to see a lot more observables in the client. In general, async iterable makes a lot of sense when you're doing I/O, right? Because you can only write at a certain speed with async iterables. And so that makes sense because you have back pressure. But if you're working with events, well, you can't tell the user to wait, right? The user is always can always click a new key. And so observables are a much better fit for evented programming, like the type of programming we see in the front end.